This is Sully for Antisocial News. Do a quick little interview. I used my deeply woven secret society connections to get a doctor who's agreed to come on under the protection of anonymity that worked with Governor Ralph Northam as a resident. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, where was your residency?
It was in Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio.
Fort Sam Houston. Okay. San Antonio, Texas. What was Ralph Northam like as a person with your interactions with him?
Overall, he seemed like a very nice guy. We got along well. He made it clear that we could never be real close friends because I was a Yankee. But besides that, we seemed to get along well. He was 1 year ahead of me in residency. Again, he was willing to teach, work together, seemed to be a hard worker. So yeah, that's sort of my general overall impression of him.
So he actually made known his Dixiecrat values.
Not overtly, but it was just, there were several residents that were from a Southern background, and they were all very tight. That made it very clear to me that I really didn't belong in that crowd because being from Ohio.
Oh, okay. I wanted to ask you, the governor of Virginia has recently come under fire for having on his yearbook page in his medical school, which I should ask you, how old were you when you got out of medical school?
Let's see, it was 1985. So I would have been 28, I guess.
Okay. So if he was of comparable age, this is a guy who, should be kind of set in his ways politically or socially, is in his mid-20s, potentially late 20s. On his yearbook page, there is a picture of a man in blackface standing next to a man dressed as a Ku Klux Klan member. And there has been significant debate as to whether or not Ralph Northam is the person in the Klan hood or blackface. Much scholarly debate about that, except the news media, where they kind of try to steer it towards the blackface, just because that's a little less offensive. If you get what I'm hinting at there, they're basically going, we don't want people to think you dressed up as a Klans guy, so we're gonna steer them towards this. So my question was, when Gayle King was interviewing him about this subject, he mentioned that he realized he was born with privilege due to his skin color. And I wanted to ask if you thought that possibly you had a similar skin tone to Ralph Northam.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. And have you ever worn a Klan outfit or blackface?
Absolutely not.
Okay. So
Ever.
So it's not just something that people born in a certain time of a certain hue just kind of, I just found myself in blackface one day hanging out with Klans people, or vice versa. That's not really how it was in medical school.
No, that never happened in any of my experiences.
Okay, this is Antisocial News, setting some news here, talking to a doctor from Fort Sam Houston who did a residency right alongside Ralph Northam, who can confirm that just being born a certain shade doesn't mean that you're going to be okay with blackface in the 80s. I feel like that's kind of a silly point to have to make, but the way you hear people talk about it on the news, it's like, well, of course, it's just white privilege. I don't think people uniformly think that. I also wanted to ask you a medical question, because the more shocking thing than what Ralph Northam was shown wearing in his yearbook is what he said on the subject of partial birth abortion. Very much sounded like he was saying, keep the infant comfortable while they wait to find out what to do with it. I wanted to ask you partial birth abortion, if you're okay with that.
sure.
Okay. I wanted to ask, a fetus that's been gestating for 8 months, is that an organ of another human being, or is that a human being?
That's a human being that, if it was born at 8 months gestation, chances are highly likely that baby would be able to survive. It may need some intervention, but would be able to be a fully functional, healthy little human that could potentially contribute greatly to mankind. So yes, it's definitely a human.
Okay. As a medical professional, and I have to say, I feel like his words on that were so shocking that, maybe he tripped and dropped his yearbook open to that picture after he said it, because it was far more damning in both a literal and philosophical sense. You're looking at very poor taste humor that denotes a crassness towards serious issues, but then you're looking at somebody who's actually talking about policy and disregard for human life. I feel like there's a huge disconnect between those two things, and I feel like we glossed over as a society the real Northam scandal, which is his support for Kathy Tran's proposal to literally kill human infants.
Yeah, I want to clarify this. I didn't see the full context in which he made his statements, but I will say I was extremely disappointed to know that he was pro-abortion in any form or fashion. But I did see in print his clarification of his statements. And to his credit, I think, at least in part, he was trying to say that if a baby was born that did have severe medical issues, there would be decisions made at the time by the medical staff, by the parents, that if these issues are not compatible with life, the parents, along with the medical staff, would do comfort care on that infant.
So that's talking about arrested development, or essentially a stillborn, almost. Like they're talking about a child that's born that's not like.
Yeah,
you've seen situations
where born extremely premature, which I don't think is what he was referencing in this case. But if it's born with issues incompatible with life, I attended a delivery in the Army at one point where his baby was a true cyclops, only had one eye, and essentially had what looked like a pig snout instead of a true nose, and had severe cardiac issues. And that baby only lived minutes, and it was extremely difficult on the family and to a lesser extent to the medical staff. But the baby, even in spite of those horrific congenital malformations, was treated respectfully up to the time that it died and afterwards.
Wow.
So I think that's more what he was referencing. So I think some of this may have been taken out of context, but there again, I didn't hear his original comments and how it was related to the other politicians said either. Hearing
a soundbite of it, it does sound like he's talking about partial birth abortion. It's clumsy. At bare minimum, if he's talking about that, what you're talking about, like basically a child that is stillborn or has no chance for life, or it was a very clumsy way of speaking that he did not get across properly. We were talking about the partial birth abortion discussion, how we don't have clarity on what his exact statement was. So I did want to ask you, before you talk about your last experience with him, or the experience you were going to share, I've heard the term non-viable fetus thrown around, and I wanted your opinion on that, because I've heard that basically when someone says non-viable fetus, they're describing a miscarriage that can't be discharged through the vaginal canal. But they can't, they're not saying that because they don't want to say dead baby. They don't want to intimate that it's a dead human, so they use these vague terms, non-viable fetus, which sounds less like a dead baby. Is that, do you think that the terminology that gets thrown around when talking about abortion or partial birth abortion with words like non-viable and fetus and stuff like that, do you think that confuses the issue, or do you think this is just medical jargon not being understood by the population?
I think it could actually be a little bit of both, because the technology has come along so far that a baby considered non-viable, even during President Kennedy's administration, he had a son that was born at 31 weeks gestation, only 9 weeks premature. He got the best medical care that was available at that time, yet his baby still died. Mm-hmm. Now we would routinely save babies that are technically non-viable without intervention, that are born at 24 weeks on up. So, and even some of the babies between 21 to 24 weeks with enough intervention can go on to have pretty healthy lives. Mm-hmm. So non-viable can be a very politically expedient term that the political left can use to their advantage. But from a medical standpoint, non-viable just means in the extreme that a baby's born with conditions that are incompatible with life, or a long life, or a non-viable baby could be one that needs a lot of medical intervention. If that all makes sense.
Okay. I'm just curious. I heard someone trying to explain that the actual argument for partial birth abortion is if the life of the mother is threatened, and then the partial birth abortion would need to happen. Understand that concept, and finally somebody explained that they were talking about septic non-viable fetus. And in that situation, they were talking about literally a fetus that had died inside the mother and had rotted. It had become septic, and the woman died because of it. And my issue when I heard them trying to explain this to me was, how is this possibly confused for abortion? I didn't know if you had heard of that same allegory or analogy or anecdotal evidence, because I've had trouble looking that story up as well. I've been trying to find, supposedly there's a woman in Texas, and I can't find that story either. But
I'm not sure exactly what that may be referencing, but with our technology again this day and age, we could screen the mother and the baby while the baby's still in utero and still inside the mother, for possibility of birth defects, sepsis, overwhelming infection from the mother and the baby, or both. So we could do a lot of that screening beforehand, or the potential risk for infection. A lot of women are born with, or carriers of what's called Group B strep, which could be no problem for them during the delivery, but can be passed on to the babies. And the babies can become overwhelmingly infected and potentially die. But fortunately, we've got all kinds of screening measures now. So, it's definitely possible to screen for those and treat for those even before the baby's even born.
Okay. You don't see any logic in there needing to be a bill that lets you terminate pregnancy at the 8th and 9th months because of the potential of getting one of these diseases or issues passed on.
I will not disguise my bias as far as being a pro-life pediatrician from the moment of conception all the way through delivery. But in my mind, if you even wanted to try to justify it, perhaps you could justify first trimester abortions in that regard. But to disguise this under the possibility that a mother's life is going to be in jeopardy enough to create a need for a partial birth abortion in the 8th or 9th month is very spurious, extremely spurious. I'm sure it can happen, but it's got to be the rarest of occasions when this might come up. And I've heard of enough heroic women who, in spite of having cancer or some sort of heart problems directly related to the pregnancy, have elected to go on with her pregnancy, even at the risk of losing their own lives, because the inherent love that develops between a mother and a baby, even while that baby's pre-born.
That's pretty awesome. If you have any links to stories like that or documentation of stories like that, I would very much like to promote that. Stories like that. That's incredible. But I have borrowed a lot of your time here. You had, I believe, one last interaction with Ralph Northam to discuss, and then I'll let you go.
This is probably definitely not a negative comment about my interactions with him, but we had a nurse who happened to be black, who was one of our neonatal intensive care nurses, who had over 30 years of experience at the time of our residency. And so I'm guessing she was probably in her mid-50s at the time, mid to late 50s. And but she too was from the South, and Ralph and several of the other Southern residents really got along well with her, and even would joke about things that was part of the exclusionary feelings that I got from being made that I was too Yankee to be in that crowd, is that they sort of had these inside secrets that they would even share with this nurse as well.
Huh.
And
well,
so they would sort of laugh and carry on with her. So they showed a lot of respect towards her. So again, that to his favor, I never saw any of the overt racism that he's being accused of either.
Well, I feel like there is some bad blood very recently here in the Virginia area, because the campaign to get him elected was so ugly, and even included a very, very offensive ad that depicted anyone who supported his opponent as a Gadsden flag waving racist who was going to run down little brown children in the streets. So it was one of the most offensive political ads I've ever seen, and I can't believe it made it on the air. And it definitely was.
Well, I think I remember seeing that one too. It's like a Hispanic young man walking through a community, and it's like he's being followed.
Yeah. And there's a guy with a pickup truck and a rebel flag and a Gadsden flag, and he's chasing them around, and of course it's preying on the fears that were stoked up after the Charlottesville incident, the attack there with the guy hitting his car into the crowd of people. It's very upsetting because it's painting this absolutely hugely broad brush, because a lot of the Republicans in Virginia are, very civilized folk, and are not in any way associate themselves with the Dixiecrat crowd to even be okay with racism like that. Also, the guy in Charlottesville who did the hit with the car was from Ohio. He wasn't even a Virginian. So to blame Ed Gillespie for that didn't make any sense. And then there's a lot of kind of, I feel a lot of people feel vindicated. A lot of people feel angry because it's like, hey, remember that you were calling us vile racists a minute ago, and now we found this picture of you in a Klan hood. There, well, So I feel like that's why it's really gotten blown out of proportion. But I feel like you've helped us steer back towards the issues and discuss the sanctity of life and what it means to be a human. It's not a cancerous polyp that might vote in 18 years. It's a human. You've got us back to that subject.
If you think about it, all babies are potentially non-viable at birth. Even if you go back thousands of years, it still took the mother, the father, the nurse midwife, the Jewish midwives back in the Hebrew days.
Well,
somebody had to act on behalf of that baby.
Well, I believe
it's not going to live.
I believe one of our great politicians said it takes a village, and another one of them pointed out that even as an adult, you didn't build that. So I think there's a question to say if any of us are viable. It's when do any of us stop being babies? We're all dependent.
That's true.
All right. Well, thank you, Doctor. Excellent chat.
You're welcome, and anytime.
Excellent.